morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's session. We're going to be covering two sides of security. We're going to be looking at both internal and external access controls and how we are seeing a convergence of these two worlds coming together, and how organizations today are working to build an integrated security strategy that brings into play your SAP platform for security and cybersecurity, as well as on the GRC front. You can't have any blind spots anymore and really need to make sure that you're putting the appropriate amount of attention in both of these areas and giving them the time they deserve. Just so you know, this session will be recorded, and if you have any questions, please post those in the webinar platform, and we'll make sure to answer those at the end of today's session. And with that, I am pleased to introduce to you my co-host today, Joris from Protect4S.
Hi, good morning. Well, I guess to most of you, and for the other people in the rest of the world, probably good day anyway. Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Joris van der Vis. Thanks for the introduction, Ryan. I'm an SAP Security Specialist and co-founder of Protect4S, and I'll be indeed one of the co-hosts for this session. I'm coming from quite a strong technical and security-related background. I've been working in the SAP field for roughly 20 years. Partially as a developer and mainly as an SAP basis consultant. And over the past 15 years, mainly specialized in what we call nowadays SAP cybersecurity. I also do quite some SAP security research, found quite some vulnerabilities in SAP software. Those are reported to SAP, for which SAP security notes are created. And I do love to share the knowledge and the experience that we have on this topic. In recent years, my partners and I have been translating the collective SAP security knowledge that we built into the Protect4S software that we do provide to SAP companies, and it makes their life easier to continuously secure their SAP solutions. Our focus is on SAP platform security, as we call it, or infrastructure security, cyber security, if you will. We are founded quite some years ago, mainly in Europe, and we are now expanding also a bit outside Europe. So indeed, as mentioned, the session will be recorded. So just you know that. Let me try and go to the next slide. Yes, so here we are with the agenda for today. As Ryan already mentioned, the topic is two-sided. Ryan will be zooming in the second part of this webinar on the more SOD GRC side of security. We will focus in the first part on the cyber security side of the so-called security coin, as we'd like to see it. And we hope to show you why the two sides go hand in hand more and more these days, and why you need both to get a proper security picture of your SAP business critical landscape. Yeah, again, if our timing is not too bad, there will be quite some time for questions at the end. Please feel free to drop them in the panel on the right. Now, on to the first part of this webinar, and let me start you with by underlining that, well, we see SAP security never as a single moment in time. It's not a static state you want to be in. It should be supported by a process. This is quite important. We'll come back to this. And we define basically three important steps in this process, which is scanning, analyzing, and mitigating. I think most of it is quite self-explanatory. It's quite important to get an insight of the SAP cybersecurity state of your landscape. And to do so, you want to automate stuff. Also, that's where tooling plays a big role. Nowadays, large customers have a lot of SAP systems. There's many controls per system. And yeah, you cannot simply do that manually anymore. And the repetition of this process is quite important to make sure with each iteration, let's say the amount of vulnerabilities and risk in your SAP landscape is simply reduced. All right, so I guess those of you who are involved in SAP Security, they probably recognize that getting insight in the state of security of your SAP landscape and also keeping it up to date with patches can be really difficult. Downtime is definitely something businesses don't want. Change processes and testing of changes is adding a lot of time to the complete time that it takes to patch your landscape. And that's not just on your SAP application layer, but also on the operating system and the database layer. What we see, SAP releases security patches on a monthly basis. And that's also one of the reasons why you are never there, right, in security land. This is an ongoing thing. Thing is, it's hard to keep up, but the other side is that you cannot, you don't want to simply wait until things go wrong, because the cost can be really high in the case of a data breach. We have some colleagues in the business, and they say hope is not a strategy, especially since the cost of a breach often way exceeds the preventive costs that you should make. And I'm not saying it's easy. How to get the needed insight in your SAP security status manually, that's simply not possible anymore. As I mentioned, there's hundreds of items to check in an SAP landscape on a deeper, low technical level. And you need several full-time employees if you want to do that manually. And that's not even taking into account the remediation of findings. That's just simply to get the insight. What we see typically at customers is, quite often they run from audit to audit. Just when they solve the findings from the previous one, a new auditor comes in with a new list of findings. Also what we see there is that in the past, where auditors typically looked at GRC SOD findings, they are now also more and more including more technical / cybersecurity related items. So there's quite a lot of challenges that SAP running organizations face. The good news is there are definitely solutions. We'll address those later. Let's first try to zoom in a bit more on the challenges I just mentioned. They're outlined here. Some key drivers, as we all do know, is that businesses depend quite heavily on their SAP systems. And in case of downtime or espionage or fraud or theft of data, the damage can be substantial. I'm not here to spread fear or try to scare people off. It's just simply a fact. We've seen it with the customers that we have over the past 10 years. If there is a breach, damage can be substantial, up to the level of bankruptcy of businesses. So again, I'm not here to spread fear. Just take a moment maybe and think about what the consequences could be in case your company gets breached. Can you still do business? Can you still ship products? Can you still help your customers? It's never a bad thing to think about it for a moment. Also, and that's more recent over the past years. We see that more and more SAP systems are using the internet as a communication medium for integration with business partners, for example. And that means that the risks have increased substantially, because in the past, where this SAP system was just running in your local area network, now it's hooked up to the internet. Your attack base has increased a lot if you use those scenarios. Also, what we have seen in the recent years is that regulators, internal and external auditors, put higher demands on security in general. For SAP, this means often that the Big Four or other auditors, as I mentioned, don't only focus on GRC and SOD anymore, but increasingly also pay attention to the cybersecurity part. They want, for example, proof that customers have a strategy, or that their SAP systems are checked for vulnerabilities on a regular interval, and that these vulnerabilities are being addressed. And that can be simply like the manual, the SAP security notes that come out every month. You should have a strategy for that, but there's way more, and I'll come back to that later. Again, as I mentioned, security is never done. It's essentially a journey. It's a process, right? And it should lead to continuous improvements. Because of, for example, these monthly released SAP security notes, new vulnerabilities should be periodically detected and remediated. And in general, you do that by applying patches. And this involves vulnerability management, patch management, configuration management. There's quite some processes that deal with that. But it's important to make sure that your systems stay up to date and secure. And as the saying goes, well, prevention is better or often cheaper than the cure. So instead of suffering the consequences of a data breach, you might want to spend some dollars or euros on trying to prevent that. Of course, everybody's limit is limited in resources and budget, but finding a good balance there is important. Not doing anything is definitely not a good strategy. Yeah, and as I mentioned, the insight that you need is simply not possible anymore without any form of automation, because there's simply too many parameters. Only looking at the parameters, there's dozens of them per system, but there's way more. And if you have a large landscape, it's hardly impossible to do that manually. How to get in control? And this is the good news, because there are definitely solutions. Again, as mentioned, one of the important things is to automate stuff, but this is not all. A process helps, especially to continuously improve things and not go from security project to security project. We see that typically at customers. They had an audit, the results should be fixed. They go fixing, they go fix the audit findings, and then it's on to the next audit and wait for the next findings. Doing so, well, it's better than nothing, but it's not helping you into the driver's seat and getting control, right? And yet, to lower risk, you should do something about your security level. And in general, typically with SAP customers, there's quite some work to do there. Mainly and especially for those SAP customers that already run SAP for, well, 10 years or longer, they have a hard time doing so, because in the past, SAP systems were typically shipped, let's say, insecure by default. To go to more secure default state, customers need to change a lot of settings. And this is not always easy, but it's definitely doable. Yeah, and also to get into control and to be stronger looking at compliance as well. You can, for example, work with baselines And if you, for example, run periodic compliancy scans, you also have better accountability because you have better traceability. You can simply look back, for example, what settings were at a specific moment in time, or what the patch levels of your system were at a specific moment in time. That helps. It helps for the audits. You can be more proactive, and you just have more grip on your SAP landscape, and you're more in control. So again, it starts with insight into your risks, into the state of your SAP landscape. How to do that? We have some live demo to show you, and let's see if Ryan, can you try and switch the screen?
Certainly. Yep, you should have control to your.
Thanks.
Perfect.
Thanks a lot. I think you can all see my screen. Ryan, can you confirm?
Yes, sir, I can.
Great, thanks. So again, because we're limited in time, we will just show some of the, let's say, core functionalities of Protect4S, but one of the most important ones in terms of compliancy is to run and schedule compliancy related scans. And this can, for example, be a baseline that you have. Many organizations start adopting, for example, nowadays the SAP Security baseline, which is a good start anyway to start with. I'm not saying it's covering everything, but it's definitely a good start to get this insight. How does this work? Within Protect4S, which is an add-on on the SAP Solution Manager, it's really easy to scan your complete SAP landscape for over 1,700 vulnerabilities in the area of cybersecurity. It's parameters, it's misconfigurations, it's stuff on the operating system and the database and the network level that should be secured, more secure. Let me show you how that works. You can define projects, and for the demo purpose, let me create a new project to show you how that works. By the way, the whole application that we designed is completely wizard-based, so also the non-technical users can work with it relatively easy. How does it work? You can define new scans, and a scan is basically nothing more than a bunch of checks that you run against the system. There's an option to export into SIEM, but let's skip that for now. You select the system. This is something you just once make connections to, and then you can scan as often as you want. You could exclude some clients if you want. If you have a client 00 or 066 you don't use or you want to exclude, you can do so. And then it will just scan, for example, a productive client, and we ship the product with some predefined templates. And for example, here we have an SAP Security baseline. There's more, but this is one you could use to hold against your SAP systems. You see quite some checks in there. As I mentioned, there's over 1,700. They're not all included in this SAP Security baseline because we have more checks, but this is definitely a good example to gain insight. This is something you can schedule, and as you can see, you can schedule this periodically. We have customers, for example, that run compliancy checks every day for a subset of specific parameters or other settings. And this is all it takes to schedule a project and run a scan. Good to mention, performance wise, the impact is really, really low. Customers won't even notice. So there's no need to be afraid for performance loss. A scan in general goes really fast. I can quickly show you some of the scan results. We'll also get back to that in another demo, but you can see here that this particular demo scan is still running. It's already completed. I will not go over all the details. As I mentioned, there is so much that we scan for. Just know that for compliancy reasons, or to see if your baseline is properly rolled out over all SAP systems, over the complete SAP landscape, this is what you can do to check that. I'll come back to the details later on. Also know that we do ship the product with, this is not the right one, with a management overview. Again, for the maybe less technical users, like a CISO or other similar users, we have a management dashboard that is also mobile friendly, that can really be used to get a quick insight in the security status of your systems. Here you can see, for example, a scan onto systems that we did lately. You see the risk percentage, you can see all the checks that were executed, all the details, if you click through, are here. You can see the checks that failed, for example, here, and you can see all the details, the vulnerability and solutions to make sure that that is mitigated. Another way to look at things is a scan comparison. And again, because of the sake of time, we cannot show everything, but let me quickly show you, because this is a strong functionality. Again, if you want to know if your baseline is enforced, for example, over your complete landscape, you can select scans that you did and then simply click the display button, and it will show you all the output in a relatively easy way, so you can quickly see if there are controls that do not comply with your baseline, for example. This can all be exported, and it's a perfect way to check hundreds and hundreds of checks on dozens of systems in just a blink of a moment. This for the compliancy part. Ryan, would you be able to switch back to the presentation?
Certainly.
Okay.
You should have control now.
I think it works. Yes. Okay. Then something about security assessments. We have been asked quite often in the past to support audits, typically from the Big Four. Why? Because they never had, they are starting to build it up now, but they didn't really have specific knowledge on this topic. So the SAP cybersecurity part was not really covered there. As mentioned earlier, the typical control frameworks within organizations often did not include these cybersecurity related risks hidden in the infrastructure of your landscape, or only for a relatively small part. And that can now be covered quite easily with Protect4S. So, and this is something, again, not to scare people, but risk in these components can be substantial. What are some typical cybersecurity related risks? Well, think, for example, of misconfigured components like the RFC gateway or the message server. They were shipped by default for years in an insecure state, which could really easily lead to a fully compromised SAP system. Still, when doing SAP security pen tests, it is in 95% of the cases, or even more, possible to gain full control of an SAP landscape. It's not that hard, especially with open source exploit kits that you can download on the internet, relatively easy. So one of the reasons is that customers often are not aware that they need to do something here, or it's simply not a priority. Yeah, and again, as mentioned, the internet has increased risk. Web dispatchers are being installed to support Fiori scenarios or HANA-based scenarios. That doesn't help as well. We've been doing SAP assessments for quite some time. We do see a bit of an increase in more secure systems, but it simply goes really slow. Yeah, to give you a bit more details on these examples that I just mentioned, let's go to another demo. This is the last demo before we switch to Ryan, his part. Ryan, could you give me once more access to the screen? Thanks a lot. So,
and I'm able to.
Yeah, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Great, thanks. Then let's go once more to some scan results. In this case, let's take, for example, the scan that we just ran. By going to the check overview, you can see all the output here, and there is a lot, again, over 1700 controls. But let's just pick out a few and see why they are a very high risk, because not every finding is important, but there are some really critical ones that you should really address. For example, there is a big vulnerability in the message server ACL. What does that mean? Your message server basically is the central point in your SAP system that does load balancing and that says to end users to which application server they can go. By default, this message server was not really protected. There should be an access control list in front of this component to really make sure that only SAP application servers can register themselves as an application server. But a couple of smart guys from Russia, they found a way to, let's say, register themselves as being an application server of SAP. And this is quite tricky because then you can do man-in-the-middle attacks and simply take over the full SAP system. If you want to know more about it, if you scan your system and you see this popping up, then all you need to do is click on the finding. You will see all the details. In this case, for example, that the message server ACL is not restrictive enough. Host is star is in there, and this is how SAP shipped their SAP products for quite some years. Many customers still have this insecure default configuration. Click on the check information. You can find solutions, references, and this is just one example. There's way more in the details here. We have HANA specific checks. We have checks for the, for example, the gateway, also critical components, standard users with default passwords. Many customers think they don't have them, but we still find them. And one system is enough, especially since most of them are quite interconnected. And that's the last thing I want to show you. Protect4S has a connection map. And a connection map is, again, a good way to get insight in your SAP systems and how they are connected to each other. You can generate this, you can view it, and don't be scared by the sheer amount of information in here, but this is basically your whole SAP landscape and how everything is connected. And there is risk in here. People not always know this, but for example, a lot of customers put SAP all roles or SAP all users in RFC connections. And this is kind of tricky because if you do that, you can, in general, jump from one system to the other, even though it's not always, it doesn't necessarily have to be a simple user that you can log on with. It can also be a system user. It doesn't really matter. If it's there, you can jump from one system to another. And Especially if these connections go from non-production to production, this increases risk. To make that visible, to get that insight, we created the connection map. There's all kinds of connections, from web dispatcher to database and SOAP kind of web services, and of course also the good old ABAP RFC connections. If you want to filter on just ABAP systems with a very high risk, you can do that. You will see the connections here. The username is in here. You can quite easily change it to the connection name, for example. By clicking on a connection, you can even get all the information about, for example, the user that is in there. As you can see, in this case, it has SAP hole. That's not a good thing. This is really helpful if you want to investigate how connections from one system to another can lead to security issues. I think that for now pretty much concludes this part of the cybersecurity part of the, let's say, security coin. Let's head over to you, Ryan, and shine some light on the other side of the coin that you know all about.
All right, I certainly will. Thank you for that demonstration there. I know I've been in the situation, and probably others on the call today, having to map all of the different SIDs and support pack levels and understanding exactly where those risks lie manually. I do wish I had a tool like that back when I was doing this previously.
If you work on an hourly rate, I think that's a good thing. But apart from that, it's a job you don't want to do.
That's exactly true. All right, so now we are going to transition to the internal threat landscape, specifically speaking about access controls. When we speak with customers, auditors, and other security professionals, we hear time and time again about the pain endured with collecting, siphoning, and interpreting access risk data. We're all seeing regulation tighten in our respective countries and our industries. And that's really what's driving the conversation today, as we're seeing the necessity for more reliable and timely insights on these risks. And we're going to focus in on not just the risks from a high-level standpoint, but really understanding how they impact and span across the enterprise. Because it's not just a single application or division of the company that you need to be looking at. You really do need to be able to have that broad perspective of risk. So in the following section, I will cover some other key drivers and how you can assist your organizations in gaining the much needed control. So some of the key drivers, looking at risk identification. So before you can start any sort of risk analysis, assessment, whatever you want to call it, you first have to understand what risks are present. And these risks are ones that impact many different stakeholders. These exercises should not be focused just from a audit view or just from an IT security. It really does include many different stakeholders. So you need to, organizations are realizing that a lot of aspects of their landscape, they don't understand what risks are present. Another key driver we hear often is an urgent need to address audit findings. They've gotten a report from their internal and potentially external auditors that explicitly call out areas in their security and governance processes which have resulted in deficiencies or material weaknesses. Now you're looking as an organization at how do we go about remediating this. We also see a lot of organizations that are a little bit further along in the maturity and journey of identifying and fixing risks where they're at a stage where they're undergoing remediation. And they're looking at the risks they've identified and still uncovering some additional risks. And they get to a crossroads where they understand what's present, but do not have a good path forward in terms of how to go about correcting it, be it through role changes, user assignments, or getting into mitigating controls. This is where we see a lot of organizations sit at in terms of they know the tactics, but aren't quite sure how best to proceed. The next two are very relevant, especially here in 2020, where we're seeing a large, we see it in the news all the time, in headcount reductions and just a lot more stress put onto the teams. So you're expected to meet the same objectives, perform the same activities, and now you're doing so with fewer employees. Huge driver for organizations to look at other ways of operating to still meet their objectives. On a similar thread, budgetary constraints. It's always a concern, but I don't think I've seen in my career a more focus on budget restrictions than we are seeing right now. And it's the same challenge. We, as an organization, have the same objectives, the same activities to complete, but now we must do so with less funding. So these are the drivers that push organizations to start looking at other solutions and other ways to operate. So those we're familiar with most of you, if not all, at least a handful of them. So the important aspect of today's call is how do you get in control of those drivers? Similar to what Yora said for Protect4S, automation is key in getting control here. If you're dealing with a smaller headcount, automation can help in alleviating those issues. Or if you're looking to really gain that visibility across the enterprise, to do so manually, where you're extracting data from every disparate system and then trying to compile it in a consumable fashion, that is not a sustainable approach. You need the assistance of automation to provide that insight. Then, once you've identified those risks, this is where you then start to remediate and really look at how do I reduce the number of risk conflicts. That's the journey that every organization should be undertaking. And once you start reducing the number of conflicts, you're now going to see that the overall risk posture has improved. Now, you may be asking, how do I do that if I have the budget restrictions that I haven't had to face in years past? Well, that's where I'm very happy to say that there are solutions out there, including ERP Maestro, that do help with that challenge and provide a low cost of ownership compared to some traditional on-prem solutions. So some things to consider there. All right. So what can ERP Maestro do to provide that clarity and control to your segregation of duties access risks? Now that you have a clearer picture of the drivers for access risk reporting and the elements required to achieve your objectives, I'd like to share with you how ERP Maestro can assist with access risk reporting and segregation of duties. Now, for those of you that are unfamiliar with the term segregation of duties, or SOD, it's simply a concept of two separate business activities that should be performed by separate and unique users. In a situation where that segregation is not maintained and the same user is able to complete both business activities or IT activities, there is the concern that fraud could take place. And so as we progress here, I'll I'll use the same example just to simplify it, and that is you would not want the same user to be able to create vendors and also pay vendors. Those are two explicit tasks that should be done by separate users. Otherwise, you get into a situation where the same user may create a fictitious vendor and then be able to pay that entity. So first off, a little bit more background on ERP Maestro. We were founded in 2013 as the first cloud-based access control solution for SAP. Now, by being cloud-based, that gives us a real advantage in being able to connect quite quickly to your SAP environment. And by being natively cloud, we are able to scale with your organization. As you grow, as you go through M&A activities, our solution is built in a way to be able to support all of that. We have about 100 customers worldwide and in every industry you can think of. Access risks, regardless of regulation, is an issue for all companies, and one that we are very pleased to say that we are able to address and help with. We're also used by 7 of the world's top 10 audit firms. They bring in our solution to assist you as their client in various internal and external audit activities. So also with this solution, you're looking at the ability to have an enterprise-wide view of access risks. You're looking at connecting to all of your ABAP-based SAP systems, as well as SAP SuccessFactors, and there are many more integration opportunities to be available shortly. What we also see from customers is many come to us because they have those immediate audit needs. Those findings have come through of deficiencies and material weaknesses, and they're looking for our assistance in remediating those. I'm very happy to say that in those situations, the deficiencies go away. They disappear and are no longer a problem. We often see it organizations that have a weak emergency access process in which there may be gaps in the control or insufficient reporting. And so those customers come to us and they see our emergency access functionality, and that then removes that deficiency. Similarly, when working with organizations that have a high proliferation of segregation of duty risks, once they bring in our reporting solution and deploy it, we do see on average about a 75% risk reduction in those first 3 months. And then with that, I do want to take a couple of minutes to show you the solution. And let me switch over to that. All right. So this is the ERP Micro Dashboard. This is the first thing any user sees when they first log into the environment, because this is the most important data that you'll want to view. You want to understand on a daily basis what risks are impacting the enterprise. So I'll go through a couple of different widgets here on the dashboard. And first I want to start off with the user risks by rating. It's a great way for organizations to be able to understand how many conflicts are impacting my end user population. We provide a rule book that you're able to customize that has a number of risk criticality levels. We use a legend of informational, low, medium, and high. And what we often see is organizations will take a risk-based approach and want to understand, well, where is the highest likelihood for exploitation of this access. And so what we do with our reports is we provide much more insight than what does a user or a role have access to, but we start to provide indications in terms of what access is truly being used. So going under that purview of a risk-based approach, what I'm going to do is really focus in on these high-level risks. But more specifically, I want to focus on those that are fully executed. So to be fully executed, that means that the user has access to an SOD conflict, and they have in fact transacted both sides of that conflict. So going back to that example I provided about being able to pay a vendor and create a vendor, this would be a situation where, in fact, a user has done both of those activities. And this would be where you'd want to focus some of your very early remediation and analysis efforts. Whereas partially executed, that implies that the user has only performed one side of the conflict. So the SOD hasn't been fully exploited, but nothing is preventing them from doing so. And then similarly with the not executed. The access and the ability to perform both functions is present, but the user either isn't aware of it or has not gone through and actually done so. The next widget over, the user risk by business process. This is a very handy graph to use for organizations that are just starting out. So we can normally deploy this for an organization in about an hour, and they will have this data at their fingertips. But then organizations they'll start scratching their heads in terms of, well, where do I start? And I see all these red and orange colors. I see these high numbers, but where do I start? And so that comes down to what are your initial objectives and that you need to address first. So many organizations will look at the user risk by business process and tackle the module where the most risk is. So they may look first at accounts payable or the sales delivery areas. But there is another approach that many organizations take and is certainly warranted, and that is where will you have the most success? Looking for areas in the organization where you can have some quick wins and identifying, apologize for the overused phrase, but the low-hanging fruit, and looking at areas where you can really make forward progress and create that momentum for the rest of the organization. We also have the ability to look at users by their highest unmitigated risk. These are going to be unique users that may be attributing to a large number of the risks that we've seen in the graph above. So it may be you only need to really focus on a handful of users to be able to reap a very significant improvement on the rest of these metrics. And then one spot where I like to really focus on first is roles by highest executed risk. These are going to be those areas where a role has an inherent SOD, and once you remediate that, you are then going to be indirectly lowering those same risks that are plaguing your users. So you have that ability to bounce between user perspective and role perspective. But you may be asking, like, well, what else can I do besides looking at these high-level numbers? Well, we're going to go back to that point of view of risk-based remediation. So what I've done is I filter out those not executed and partially executed, and I really want to hone in on those high, fully executed risks. And from here, you're very easily able to see what users have high risks, and explicitly, what are those risks? So you can see here that Alyssa has the ability to perform activities related to sales order processing as well as delivery processing. And you can see she's actually performed both functions on a very considerable level. And this level of detail may be appropriate for you and your background and what you're trying to report on. Certainly those more from an audit and compliance background. Whereas others may be looking to get a little more into the weeds, a little more technical, and want to understand what is truly at play here to constitute this risk. And that's where you're able to dive deeper and look at it from a transaction code level. Okay, so what T codes is she performing on the sales order side or the delivery processing? And then some of you may want to go even further and look at it from an authorization level, understanding what values are assigned that is creating this risk. And that's the level you need to get to in order to properly remediate. Once you get into the remediation, that takes us to the last part of this demo, and that is where you're able to simulate what happens if I go through a role change. So we see the user simulations used frequently with user management processes. So being able to identify if this role is assigned to a user, what are the SOD implications? Instead of having to provision blindly, run another report and realize that you have in fact just enabled this user access to a wide variety of risks. That's on the user management side. Then also we have the what-if analysis simulations for role management. So looking at single and composite roles, you're able to very quickly understand what are the implications of assigning a transaction code to an existing role. Because again, your change management process is there to protect the organization. You would not want a role to get promoted to production if there were unknown risks. So you can use this to understand that early on in the role and change management process. I know I went through that quite quickly, so please do reach out if you have any questions and would like to see a deeper dive on these aspects. And with that, I will go back to our presentation here. So a couple other aspects about ERP Maestro. What I just covered there was the Access Analyzer module, focusing on the reporting of segregation of duties and sensitive access. But we do have 3 other modules to really help you build out your full GRC program with a set of automated tools to support you in areas such as periodic access reviews, with our Access Reviewer, to be able to hone in on what reviewers should be recertifying. So the tool will go through and compile the reports. It will send out the emails and reports to the reviewers across the organization, and then administrators are able to keep a close tie on progress and any SLAs you have in place. I mentioned emergency access earlier as a very common audit finding, where there's the necessity for adding tools and more stringent processes. We provide a solution for that includes the requesting as well as the provisioning and deprovisioning of elevated access. Probably the slickest component of our emergency access module, though, is going to be our review report. So in my opinion, the critical piece of an emergency access process is that there's an authoritative figure that comes back and signs off on what access was used and executed during that period of elevated access. And so we provide a very business-friendly report that highlights what access was executed and whether or not it was sensitive in nature and if that user could use it every day. And then lastly, we have our provisioning module for creating new users, a change of access for existing users, and that includes a proactive or preventative segregation of duties, what-if analysis. So you know well before that request is approved and provisioned whether or not there is any SOD consideration. In the event that there is risk, as a part of that workflow, mitigating controls can be assigned directly to that user to help further lower risk exposure and align with your risk management and policies around GRC. And with that, I will pass it back to yours to close us out today.
Thanks, Ryan. And thanks for showing the other side of SAP Security. And traditionally, those are two completely different worlds, right? But I think it's good and great that the two of us cooperate in this sense and really try and close all the loops and look at SAP Security more holistically, if you want to use that word. Yeah, I think it's undeniable that those two worlds that we just discussed will collide more and more in the upcoming years. Good to see also that you guys have a strong automation where manual work is completely reduced. Yeah, I think basically everything is said already about these topics. Yeah, I think also looking at the time, maybe we can see if there are some questions in the panel. I haven't seen them. Maybe we can give people another minute to try and raise some. Yeah, and otherwise, I think thanks at least for sharing this insight, Ryan, and sharing the knowledge.
No problem. It was a pleasure working with you, and for all of our attendees today, please do reach out. We have some contact details there. If you do have questions, please let us know. We'd be more than happy to address those, and really do thank everyone for participating today.
Thanks.
Yours, a pleasure working with you, and looking forward to continuing.
Thanks. The same here.